A mother smiles beside her daughter in 1909. But the truth has left experts speechless. The air in the Boston Historical Society archive room was thick with the scent of aged paper and leather bindings. Dr. Helen Cartwright, a photography curator specializing in early 20th century American portraits, carefully lifted a cardboard box marked uncatalogued 1900-1910 from the metal shelf. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 2023, and she had been working through the backlog for weeks. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, she found dozens of photographs. Most were typical for the era: stiff family portraits, children in their Sunday best, stern-faced men in dark suits. But one image made her pause. A woman and a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, posed together in what appeared to be a modest parlor. The girl sat on a wooden chair, her expression somber, her hands folded in her lap. Beside her stood the mother, one hand resting on the child's shoulder, her face turned toward the camera with what looked like a gentle smile. Helen brought the photograph closer to the window, letting natural light illuminate the sepia tones. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't immediately identify what. The composition was standard, the clothing appropriate for 1909 based on the date penciled on the back. Yet an inexplicable unease crept through her chest. She reached for her magnifying glass and examined the woman's face more carefully. The smile seemed odd, not quite natural. The muscles around the mouth and eyes not quite aligned the way they should be in a genuine expression. The woman's posture, too, was peculiar, too rigid, too perfectly still. Then Helen noticed the woman's eyes. Even through the grain of the old photograph, even across more than a century, there was something profoundly absent in that gaze. They were open, directed at the camera, but utterly, completely vacant. Helen's hand trembled slightly as she set down the magnifying glass. She had studied thousands of Victorian and Edwardian photographs. She knew the customs, the techniques, the social practices of that era. And suddenly, with a cold certainty that made her stomach tighten, she understood exactly what she was looking at. Helen stepped back from her desk, her breath shallow. She had encountered post-mortem photography before. It was a common practice in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a way for grieving families to preserve one final image of their departed loved ones. But those photographs were usually easy to identify. The deceased were typically laid out peacefully, eyes closed, surrounded by flowers, clearly at rest. This photograph was different. Disturbingly different. The woman appeared to be standing. Her eyes were open, and that smile, carefully positioned, eerily present, suggested she was alive, participating in a normal family portrait. But the more Helen examined the image, the more details emerged that contradicted that impression. She returned to her desk and positioned a high-intensity lamp over the photograph. Using her magnifying glass again, she studied the woman's hand on the child's shoulder. The fingers were positioned naturally enough, but there was no tension in them, no grip. They simply rested there, placed deliberately. Helen moved to the woman's face again. The smile wasn't formed by muscle movement, it was held in place, fixed. She had seen this before in post-mortem photographs where families requested that the deceased be posed with pleasant expressions. Photographers would use thin wires, cotton, or careful positioning to create the illusion of a peaceful, almost living countenance. But standing, with eyes open, Helen reached for her phone and photographed the image, then transferred it to her computer. She opened photo enhancement software and increased the contrast, sharpened the details, zoomed in on specific areas. What she saw made her push back from the desk. Behind the woman, barely visible against the dark wallpaper of the parlor, was a metal stand, the kind used in post-mortem photography to hold bodies upright. She could just make out the frame behind the woman's dark dress, the support running up her back. "My God," Helen whispered to the empty room. This wasn't just a post-mortem photograph. This was an elaborate staging designed to make a dead woman appear alive, standing beside her living daughter, smiling for eternity. Helen sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the photograph on her screen. The implications were staggering, not because post-mortem photography was shocking in itself, but because of the extraordinary effort taken to create this specific illusion. Someone had gone to remarkable lengths to make this woman appear living, vital, present. Why? She turned the original photograph over again, studying the faded pencil marks on the back. The date, April 1909, was clear enough. Below it, in different handwriting, were 2 words: last portrait. Nothing else. No names, no location, no photographer's mark. Helen opened her laptop and began searching through the Historical Society's database, cross-referencing the box number and acquisition records. The collection had been donated in 1987 by an estate clearance in Salem, Massachusetts, a town about 16 miles north of Boston, known for its colonial history and, more grimly, its 17th-century witch trials. The donation records listed the estate as belonging to a woman named Dorothy Whitmore, who had died at 93 with no living relatives. The house had been cleared, its contents divided between various institutions and auction houses. The Historical Society had received several boxes of photographs, documents, and letters, most still uncatalogued after nearly 4 decades. Helen made a note of the Salem connection and returned to the photograph itself. She needed to understand more about the specific technique used here. Post-mortem photography was well documented, but this particular staging, upright, eyes open, smiling, was unusual enough to warrant specialized knowledge. She reached for her phone and dialed Marcus Green, a colleague at the American Photography Institute in New York who specialized in Victorian funeral customs and memorial practices. "Marcus, it's Helen. I need your expertise on something unusual." "How unusual?" His voice carried a mix of curiosity and caution. "Post-mortem portrait 1909, but the subject is posed standing with eyes open. Full staging to appear alive." There was a pause. "Send me the image." Helen transferred the enhanced photographs to her email and sent them. She heard Marcus's computer chime on the other end of the line. Another long pause. "Helen, where did you find this?" Marcus's voice had changed, become quieter, more serious. Helen felt her unease deepen. "It came from an estate donation in Salem, Massachusetts," she said. "Why? What am I looking at?" She heard him exhale slowly. "You're looking at what was called a living memorial photograph. Extremely rare, extremely controversial, even by the standards of the time. Most professional photographers refuse to do them." Helen pulled her chair closer to the phone. "Explain." Standard post-mortem photography was about creating peaceful, dignified final portraits, Marcus began. The deceased were posed as if sleeping, surrounded by flowers, clearly at rest. It was a way for families to cope with loss, especially when infant and child mortality was so high. But what you've found is different. This is an attempt to deny death entirely, to create the illusion that the deceased is still among the living. "But why?" Helen asked. "What purpose would that serve?" "Grief," Marcus said simply. "Profound, unbearable grief." These photographs were usually commissioned by families who couldn't accept the loss, particularly of young mothers or children. They wanted one final portrait that showed their loved one as they remembered them, alive, present, part of the family. Helen looked at the photograph again, at the little girl sitting so solemnly beside her mother's carefully posed body. How would they even accomplish this? The technical challenges alone. "Specialized equipment," Marcus explained. "Heavy metal frames that could support a body in an upright position, hidden behind clothing and furniture. Wires to position the head and limbs. For the eyes, they sometimes used glass prosthetics or photographed the subject with eyes partially open and then hand-tinted the image to make them appear more lifelike. The smile would have been the hardest part, probably achieved through careful positioning of the jaw and mouth, maybe cotton or wire supports." Helen felt a chill run through her. "And photographers actually did this?" "A very few, usually working in secret. It was considered macabre even then, crossing a line that most found disturbing. These photographers operated on the edges of respectability, charging enormous fees for their discretion and skill." After her conversation with Marcus, Helen knew she needed to identify the people in the photograph. The little girl would be the key. If she had lived to adulthood, there might be records, obituaries, or descendants who could provide context. She returned to the Historical Society's archives, and requested all the remaining boxes from the Dorothy Whitmore estate. By late afternoon, 6 additional containers sat on her work table, each filled with fragile documents, letters, and photographs spanning nearly a century. Helen worked methodically, careful not to damage the aged materials. In the third box, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and foxed with age. The inside cover bore an inscription in careful script: "Property of Eleanor Bradford, Salem, Massachusetts, 1909. Helen's pulse quickened. She opened the journal gently, turning to the first entries dated January 1909. The handwriting was that of a child, practicing penmanship with simple observations about weather and daily chores. But as she progressed through the months, the entries became more personal, more emotional. March 15th, 1909. Mother is very ill. Doctor says there is nothing more to be done. Papa sits with her every night. I am frightened. March 28th, 1909. Mother passed in the night. Papa will not speak. Mrs. Henderson from next door has taken charge of the household. Everything feels cold and empty. April 2nd, 1909. Papa has made arrangements. He says we must have a proper portrait, that Mother must be remembered as she was. I do not understand what he means. April 8th, 1909. A man came to the house today with strange equipment. Papa sent me upstairs, but I watched from the landing. They brought Mother down from her room. She was dressed in her Sunday clothes. I wanted to run to her, but Mrs. Henderson held me back. The man positioned Mother in the parlor, arranging her just so. It took hours. April 9th, 1909. Today we took the portrait. Papa insisted I sit beside Mother. He said I must be brave, that this was important. Mother's hand was on my shoulder, but it was so cold. Her eyes were open, but she did not see me. I tried to smile as Papa asked, but I could not. The man with the camera said it was finished. Papa wept. Helen set down the journal, her hands shaking. She now knew the child's name, Eleanor Bradford, and she understood the devastating grief that had driven this elaborate, disturbing memorial. Helen continued reading Eleanor's journal, each entry revealing more about the family's tragedy and the father's inability to accept his wife's death. The portrait session had clearly traumatized the young girl, but her father's grief had blinded him to her suffering. April 12, 1909. Papa has placed the portrait in the parlor where Mother used to sit. He speaks to it sometimes, as if she can hear him. Mrs. Henderson says he is unwell with grief, that we must be patient with him. April 20th, 1909. I cannot go into the parlor anymore. When I see the portrait, I remember Mother's cold hand, her empty eyes. Papa grows angry when I refuse to sit with him there. He says I am dishonoring Mother's memory. May 3rd, 1909. Papa dismissed Mrs. Henderson today. He says we do not need her help, that our family is complete as it is. But we are not complete. Mother is gone, and the woman in the portrait is not her. It is only a terrible pretending. The entries painted a picture of a household consumed by grief and delusion. Eleanor's father, whose name Helen learned was Thomas Bradford, had worked as an accountant for a shipping company in Salem. His wife, Catherine, had died of tuberculosis at 32, leaving him alone with their only child. Helen set the journal aside and searched through more documents, finding letters, receipts, and official records. One letter, dated April 1909, was from a photographer named Silas Morehouse to Thomas Bradford. The paper was of fine quality, the handwriting professional but cautious. "Mr. Bradford," it read, "I have completed the enhancements to the portrait as you requested. The hand tinting of your wife's complexion and eyes has been executed with utmost care to achieve the lifelike appearance you desired. As we discussed, I must emphasize that this work remains strictly confidential. My professional reputation depends upon discretion in such delicate matters. The final portrait will be delivered to your residence on April 10th. The balance of $75 is due upon receipt." $75 in 1909, Helen quickly calculated, would be equivalent to over $2,000 today. Thomas Bradford had spent an enormous sum for this elaborate illusion, money he likely couldn't afford on an accountant's salary. Helen found more evidence of Thomas Bradford's deteriorating state in the following months. Bank statements showed mounting debts, unpaid bills, and eventually notices of foreclosure on the family home. But most disturbing were Eleanor's journal entries from the summer and fall of 1909. June 14, 1909. Papa no longer goes to work. He sits in the parlor all day, staring at the portrait. He has conversations with it, with her, telling Mother about his day, asking her opinion on household matters. Sometimes he laughs at things only he can hear. I take my meals in the kitchen, alone. July 22, 1909. I am frightened of Papa now. Last night I woke to find him standing in my doorway holding a candle. He said I look so much like Mother that it pains him to see me growing older while she remains forever young in the portrait. His eyes were strange, distant. August 30th, 1909. Mrs. Henderson came by today, uninvited. She found Papa in the parlor, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. She says he has lost considerable weight, that he is not well. She wants to send for his brother in Boston, but Papa refuses all help. He says his family is here, that we need no one else. September 15th, 1909. The landlord came with a constable today. Papa owes many months' rent. They argued in the hallway while I hid upstairs. I heard Papa shouting that he could not leave, that Catherine, that Mother, was here, that this was her home. The constable spoke gently, saying arrangements must be made. They gave Papa until the end of the month. Helen's chest tightened as she read. She was witnessing a complete psychological collapse, documented in a child's careful handwriting. Eleanor had been trapped in a house with a father lost to grief and delusion, forced to live in the shadow of an elaborate death portrait. She continued searching through the documents and found a newspaper clipping from the Salem Evening News, dated October 8, 1909. The headline read, "Local man hospitalized following breakdown." The brief article reported that Thomas Bradford, 38, had been admitted to the Danvers State Hospital after neighbors reported concerning behavior. His daughter, Eleanor, age 8, had been placed in the temporary care of relatives in Boston. The portrait was not mentioned. Helen now understood the immediate aftermath of the portrait, but she needed to know what had become of Eleanor. Had she recovered from this traumatic childhood? Had she ever spoken about what happened? She returned to the estate records and found a packet of legal documents tied with faded ribbon. Inside were adoption papers dated November 1909, transferring custody of Eleanor Bradford from her hospitalized father to her aunt and uncle in Boston, Margaret and James Burton. Attached to the adoption papers was a handwritten note from Margaret Burton to her brother Thomas, written in careful, compassionate prose. "Thomas, Eleanor is safe with us. She is a bright, resilient child, though she carries wounds that will take time to heal. She has asked that we not speak of the portrait, and we have honored that request. The doctors say you are improving, that with time and treatment you may recover. But Eleanor cannot return to that house, to those memories. I hope you understand. She needs a chance to be a child again, to live without the weight of grief and darkness. With love and sorrow, Margaret." Helen found no response from Thomas. Instead, she discovered his death certificate, dated March 1910. He had died at Danvers State Hospital, the cause listed as consumption and melancholia. He was 39 years old. Eleanor's story, however, continued. Helen found school records showing that she had attended public schools in Boston, graduating from high school in 1919. There was a marriage certificate from 1925. Eleanor Burton married to Robert Whitmore, a banker. Birth certificates for 2 children, James in 1926, Dorothy in 1928. Dorothy, the name on the estate that had donated these materials to the Historical Society. Helen's hands trembled as she realized the connection. Dorothy Whitmore, who had died in 1987 at 93, was Eleanor's daughter, the granddaughter of the woman in the portrait. The boxes Helen had been sorting through represented Eleanor's entire life, preserved and eventually donated after Dorothy's death. But why had Eleanor kept the portrait? Why preserve something so traumatic? In the final box, Helen found a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. It was addressed to whoever finds these photographs in handwriting she now recognized as Eleanor's, though written with the trembling uncertainty of advanced age. Helen carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was dated June 1982. To the finder of these materials, it began. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, though I was born Eleanor Bradford in Salem, Massachusetts in 1901. I am writing this letter because I know these photographs and documents will outlive me, and I believe the truth should be preserved alongside them, no matter how painful that truth may be. The portrait of my mother and me, taken in April 1909, represents both the deepest love and the most profound darkness I have ever known. My father commissioned that photograph in a moment of grief so overwhelming that it destroyed his reason. He could not accept that my mother was gone, and so he created an elaborate fiction, a portrait that denied death itself. I was 8 years old, sitting beside my mother's carefully posed body, her cold hand on my shoulder, her empty eyes staring at nothing. I understood even then that what my father had done was wrong, that it violated something sacred. But I also understood that he did it out of love, out of a desperate, impossible need to keep her with us. For many years, I tried to forget that portrait, to erase it from my memory. My aunt and uncle gave me a new life in Boston, a chance to heal and grow. I married, had children, built a happy life, but the portrait haunted me. Not because it was macabre, though it was, but because it represented a question I have carried my entire life. How do we honor the dead without being consumed by them? My father was consumed. The portrait destroyed him. But in my old age, I have come to see it differently. It was his way of saying goodbye, of holding on for one more moment before letting go. He simply didn't know how to let go afterward. I have kept this portrait all these years, not out of morbidity, but as a reminder. A reminder that grief is love with nowhere to go. A reminder that we must allow ourselves to mourn, but also to release. A reminder that the dead do not need us to preserve them in photographs. They need us to carry them forward in our hearts, in our stories, in the lives we continue to live. My mother was a gentle, loving woman who died too young. The woman in that portrait is not her, but the love that created it, twisted and desperate as it was, that was real. And perhaps that is worth preserving too, so that others might understand the terrible power of grief and the importance of finding healthy ways to honor those we have lost. If you have found this letter, I hope you will treat these materials with care and understanding. Tell my family's story if you wish, but tell it completely, not as a tale of horror, but as a testament to love, loss, and the difficult journey toward healing. With hope that truth brings understanding, Eleanor Bradford Whitmore. Helen sat in her office as evening light filtered through the windows, Eleanor's letter resting on her desk beside the portrait that had started this journey. 5 months had passed since she first discovered the photograph, and in that time, she had pieced together not just the facts of a family tragedy, but the human story beneath it. She had presented her findings at a symposium on Victorian memorial practices, carefully contextualizing the portrait within the broader history of post-mortem photography and grief customs. The response had been profound. Not sensationalism or horror, but genuine empathy for a family torn apart by loss and the desperate measures taken to cope with it. Several descendants of the Bradford and Whitmore families had contacted the Historical Society after reading about the discovery. They shared their own family stories, filling in gaps that Eleanor's letter and documents had left open. They spoke of Eleanor herself, a woman they remembered as kind, resilient, and deeply private about her early childhood, but who had lived a full, meaningful life despite its traumatic beginning. The portrait now resided in a climate-controlled case in the Historical Society's permanent exhibition on American mourning customs. But Helen had insisted on displaying it alongside Eleanor's letter, Thomas's correspondence with the photographer, and excerpts from Eleanor's childhood journal. The exhibition didn't sensationalize the image. It honored it, presenting it as a complex artifact of love, grief, and human fragility. Helen often returned to look at the portrait, seeing it differently now. The little girl sitting so solemnly was no longer just a historical subject. She was Eleanor. who had survived trauma and built a life of purpose and meaning. The woman standing behind her, carefully posed in death, was Catherine, who had lived and loved and left behind a family that missed her desperately. And the portrait itself, once disturbing and inexplicable, had become something else. A bridge between past and present, a reminder that every photograph holds stories beyond its surface. Stories of the people who lived, loved, grieved, and eventually found their way forward. On her desk, Helen kept a quote from Eleanor's letter, framed and visible. "Grief is love with nowhere to go." It reminded her, every day, that behind every historical artifact, every strange practice, every seemingly inexplicable action, there are human hearts trying to make sense of loss. The portrait from 1909 was no longer just a curiosity or a dark relic. It was a testament to the enduring power of love, even in its most desperate and misguided forms. And perhaps that, Helen thought, was the truth that had left experts not speechless with horror, but speechless with recognition. The recognition that grief in all its forms is simply love persisting beyond death, searching for somewhere to rest. The photograph remained frozen in time, but its story, Eleanor's story, Catherine's story, Thomas's story, lived on, not as a tale of darkness, but as a deeply human reminder of our shared need to remember, to honor, and ultimately, to heal.